Okay, today is Sunday, and it's Chamisha also with Tavis. It's the 15th day in the month of Tavis, and we're starting Perek Yud Beis in Tanya. Perek Yud Beis v'Habeinani. Yesterday we started in Achitas, and today we're starting it in Shir. V'Habeinani. The whole Tanya is called the Sefer Shel Beinani. The Alter Rebbe wrote a Sefer for Beinani. And all the 11 prakim, we're going to get to this. We were waiting to get to here. Yeah? The first bunch of prakim, he defined what's a person, a nefesh lekis and a nefesh bahamis. Then he talked about the struggle within a person and the tzaddik and the rosha. And when you get to chapter 12, Perek Yud Beis, Alter Rebbe is finally ready to get to v'habeinani. What's a beinani? Says the Rebbe, what's a beinani? Shale'elam ein hara geiver. In a beinani, the evil never dominates. Kol kach, to such an extent, lichbeish esehir kitana, to conquer the small city, the miniature city, which means leislabish beguf lachatiyah, to come down into the body to make it sin. Huh? A beinani is a person. We're not saying he has no ra. We're not even saying that the Ra is not goyver. We're simply saying that the Ra is not goyver kol kach lichbeish esehir, which is the guf. The neshama has many layers. Which layer of the neshama meets the guf to push the guf in a certain direction? The lowest level of the neshama. All levels above that, the Ra could be goyver. But at least the Ra is not goyver in a beinani so much to conquer the small city, to enter into the body of Lachtir, to make it. In other words, your neshama and your nefesh, my nefesh bahamis meet in many levels. The last place they meet is in the guf. Says the Alter Rebbe, in as much as they meet in the guf, here not. All the madreigas where the neshama meets the nefesh bahamis that are above the guf, no one is going to say that the Ra is not goyver. He's a beinani, not a tzaddik. But this gaber kol kach lichbeish esehir ktana l'sabit b'aguf, this not. And he tells you what that means. The hainu. What would it mean if the Ra would be goyver lichbeish esehir ktana hu aguf? Sheshlei shelevushei nefesh bahamis. The three garments of the animals, sheheim, which are machshava dibur u'maisa, thought, speech, deed. Shemitad klip, which come from klip, and of course this is in concert with the yesod in the Tanya, that the two nefashos are complete entities. They're not just batteries; they're living things with a mind. The nefesh lekis has its own mind. The nefesh bahamis has its own mind, and I believe it's going to come up today in our Hayom Yom class with Mishram the next hour. They have their own heart, and they have their own garments. When you think a mitzvah, you're thinking with the nefesh lekis. When you're thinking the shtus, you think with nefesh bahamis, and you flip-flop between nefesh to nefesh. Each time you go from machshava to machshava, and from dibur to dibur, and maisa to maisa. So they're complete systems. So there's machshava, dibur, and maisa, which belongs to the nefesh bahamis. Not the nefesh bahamis thinks behemiistic things. No, the thought itself, the oisias themselves, are from the behema. And in the case of the beinani, I'm reading it again, sheshlei shelevushei nefesh bahamis. The three garments of the animal soul. Shei machshava dibur u'maisa, which are thought, speech, and action. Shemitzad the klipa, which come from klipa. And one of the words we focused on a lot is the word tumah. Because one of the things about klipa is it doesn't have to be bad. It has to just be not good. Says the Rebbe, and gave them on nefesh lekis, they don't dominate, they don't overpower the divine soul so much, leislabish beguf, to reveal themselves in the body, b'mayach, in the mind, to think, ubepeh, in the mouth, to speak, ubesha'ar, ramach everim, in the 200 remaining of the 248 limbs, to act. La'achatiyam, to make them sin. What's the next word? Ulatamam chas v'shon, to make them tummy. And I am telling you that the reason the word tumah is used is because tumah is edeler than chet. Chet means a transgression. Hashem says, don't do it, and you do it. Tumah means Hashem didn't say, yes, do it, and you do it. You understand? Taivas heted. A person enjoys Elam Hazeh. It's not a Aveda. But it's not Kedusha. And if it's not Kedusha, it's automatically Hepech. One of the Yossi of the Tanya is that there's no middle. There's no Paraf. And that's why the word tumah is used, because the word tumah brings out that klipas nega, which is being done on a klipas nega level, because it's not kedusha, because it's not bottled to the Eibishter. If it's not bottled, it's not a very distinction. Bottled to the Eibishter is an infant tumah, an infant separation. What's the fact? That when you're talking about this person, the three garments of the godly soul. And again, I'm repeating. Remember, we hold, the Tanya holds, that the two neshamas are complete systems. The Nefesh Elokis has the Tainug and Ratzon and Chochma and Bina and Mides and Ihi and Machshava, Dib and Mais. The Nefesh HaBahamis has a separate system. Tainug and Ratzon and Chochma and Bina and Mides and Ihi and Machshava and Dib and Mais. And when it comes to the lowest level, the Irktanazu Aguf, the Beinani only allows the Neshama to dominate. The three garments of the godly soul. They and they alone are revealed in the body. Which are machshava, thought, dibah, speech, or ma'aseh, action, shall tayag mitzvahs hatera. But one of the things I'm saying, of course, this includes any inyan of reshus which a person does l'shem shamayim. If you eat l'shem shamayim, if you dress l'shem shamayim, if you walk l'shem shamayim, if you talk l'shem shamayim, you sleep l'shem shamayim, anything you do l'shem shamayim is also avodas Hashem. Says the Rebbe, so a Beinani is azoy. The term that he uses is his gabrus, right? There's two nefashis. One is toiv and the other is ra. One is good and the other is evil. And of course, the beginning of the conversation is that the meaning of the word good and evil in Tanya doesn't mean a person who's kind versus a murderer. Good and evil, the language of Tanya means batal letzli yisbarach and not batal letzli yisbarach. Bittul ta Hashem is good. Otherwise, it automatically, Tanya chapter 6, it's a yesod. So there's toiv and ra, batal ta Hashem and not batal ta Hashem. And they meet on every level. These two nefashos meet on every level. So the Alter Rebbe, in the case of the Beinani, there's only one limitation. That the Nefesh Elokis never gives the Nefesh HaBahamis control over Irktanus Aguf. All the levels above the Guf, there could be the Hisgabrus of Ra, because he's a Beinani and he can't help himself. You know, the language of the Tzaddik, Ra Kof of Lateiv, is not Shayach by a Beinani. It's just simply not possible. He doesn't have that kind of mastery over self. The only place where he's a balabais, as we're going to be discussing, of course, at length.
When you say the only place, it makes it sound like...
It's a simple thing.
Yeah, it's a minimal.
See, I have to point out that I'm not saying. I'm translating words.
I hear you.
And I'm simply pointing out the language of the Alter Rebbe. Point well taken. I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, I'm in the same boat.
When I think of the people who were, the Rebbe or the Alter Rebbe said that they're a Beinani, like, hello. You know what I'm saying?
They were graced about the Madrege. Yeah. The Rebbe Rashab said about the Rebbe, so neach. Zeitenweise is a Beinani. But so neach. Zeitenweise is a Beinani. Zeitenweise is a Beinani. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe says that on the level of Irktanazu Aguf, the Ra is never goyver. And you see, when you're speaking about the meeting between Teva and Ra and the Guf, you use the word as Gabras, right? Force 1, Force 2, city. When you talk about above the Guf, you can't use the word as Gabras. You can only use the word Kfifa. One is bent to the other, and one is not bent. I guess you could use the word as Gabras as well. But the Beinani's definition is that when it comes to the Guf, when it comes to expressing itself through his body, Ra has no dominance. And then he says, of course, the words which are so difficult to understand. He has never done an Aveda. And he will never do an Aveda in his life. And he never carries the title Rasha. Even for 1 hour. And 1 moment, Kol Yamav, for the entire duration of his life. For the entire duration of his life. These words, are the words that make everybody stop and pause and sober. You know, we've been learning Tanya for a long time, yeah? In Beis Medrash and Nashim Bonis, this is round 3. So we learned Tanya a number of times already, start to finish. And we all know the difference between a Beinani and a Tzaddik is a Beinani doesn't do an Aveda and a Tzaddik cannot do an Aveda. A Tzaddik loves Hashem, so he hates evil. A Beinani does not hate evil because he doesn't love Hashem. He just does, he serves Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe speaks about a Beinani. And he says of the Beinani, the Yovar Aveda Meyama V'Layav. He hasn't and he will never do an Aveda. This makes everybody stop and pause and say, what does that mean? How could you say about a Beinani that he never did, never will do an Aveda? The whole point is that he's Lepesach Chatas Revis. The whole definition of a Beinani is that he's susceptible and vulnerable to us, and he's not a tzaddik. So these words, Le'avar Aveda, Miyamav. So Le'avar Le'elam, say, wait a minute, you're talking about Beinani or tzaddik? So of course there's many conversations that need to be had on these words. Le'avar Aveda, Miyamav, Le'avar. And when I was in Cheder, was in yeshiva, this is one of the things that the Mashpiyim spent a lot of time enlightening for us, teaching us, pointing out to us, the Le'avar Aveda, Le'avar Le'avar. So there's a few discussions that we have to have, okay? And I'm going to start from the first discussion. The first discussion is, and again, I'm telling it to you the way it was taught to me, that in Tanya there are different Beinanis. There isn't just one Beinani. Because the discussion of Beinani really goes on till Perich Chav Hei. Till chapter 25, the Alter Rebbe is giving eitzes. We're holding 12. Yud Beisel Chav Hei is Nifel Perakim, is 14 Perakim. The Alter Rebbe is going to dedicate to different types of Beinani, different methods of being Beinani. In Chav Hei, he's already not talking about a different kind of Beinani. He's talking about what happens when a Beinani has a hard time achieving Beinani or sustaining Beinani and so on. But there's different types of Beinani. And one of the categorizations that our teachers taught us when we were children, when we were bachrim, is that there's something called Madregas HaBeinani and there's something called Midas HaBeinani. Madregas HaBeinani means the level of the Beinani. And Midas HaBeinani means the measure of a Beinani, the reality of a Beinani. Chapter 14, Perek Yudal, which is 2 parakim after this, begins with the words V'hinei Midas HaBeinani, Midas Kolodom, Acharei Kolodom Yimshech. And he says, V'chol Shah, V'chol Rega, it's Rishut Shalodom, we misgaber over himself. And the way we're taught Tanya, Midas HaBeinani is a much lower level than Madregas HaBeinani. Midas HaBeinani, as some people say, it's take it one day at a time, 1 minute at a time. Midas HaBeinani means take 60 seconds of your life. Could you be a Beinani for 60 seconds? That's Midas HaBeinani. You know, Yossi Denberg from Florida, heard of him. Yeah, I gotta give a man credit. I mean, Yossi Denberg is a very successful shliach. He's a very successful man. He's Reb Nissen's nephew. Reb Nissen's great nephew. His father's Leibur Denberg, so Gesund sein. Leibur Denberg's mother was Reb Nissen's Schwester, Nissen's younger sister. I think her name was Itahenya. I mean, I'm married to an Eminov. This is Mamish Mishpacha. So he tells a story how Reb Nissen would visit Montreal. Reb Nissen visited Montreal, they gave him Kol V'Lochem. And Peretz Mochkin, who was a lot older than Reb Nissen, revered him. He looked up to Reb Nissen. Chachafili, he was older than him. He didn't see himself on the same adregi as Reb Nissen. But Reb Nissen stayed by his nephew. Leibur Denberg. Leibur Denberg was without a beard. I think he's still without a beard. The Tata Zayin, he said Shaya Denberg was a Tommy, was a Bucky Bishas. Leibur Denberg went through the very, very difficult years. His father passed away when he was a boy. He said Kaddish for him in 1942. And he has not had an easy life. And Reb Nissen was stark with Kaddish. His whole Yiddishkeit was Reb Nissen. His whole life, Reb Nissen Nemenov was his uncle. And Reb Nissen Nemenov was a real Ovid. I mean, there was no days off. There was no free nights and weekends. You understand? And Reb Nissen had an incredible ashpah on his nephew. And verkehrt, the father said given a Yid. But Reb Nissen was Pashat, he was poil on his nephew. They should be a Yid. And some of his children are Pashat Shluchim. So whenever he came to Montreal, he stayed in his house. They didn't have enough bedrooms. They didn't have a big house. So one of the boys had to be Reb Nissen's roommate. As they given to say that. They took turns. So when Reb Nissen went to sleep, when Reb Nissen woke up, he didn't do too much sleeping, yeah. But one of the boys got to sleep in the same room as Reb Nissen. So Yossi Denberg tells the story. I heard it from him myself. That he was a boy before Bar Mitzvah. He said to Reb Nissen, is it true that you're a Beinani? So Reb Nissen didn't answer that question. Reb Nissen simply asked him a kasha. Do you think that for 60 seconds you can control yourself? You're going to control what you're going to think and control what you're going to say and control what you're going to do. So he said, yeah, I can do it. So he says, yeah, how are you going to control yourself? He said, when I get to Meise, I'll sit on the hand. He says, I'll sit on my hands, I won't be able to do anything, so I can't do anything wrong. When I get to Dibur, I'll keep my mouth shut. And when I get to Machshava, I will focus on a thought that's good, and for 60 seconds, I can do it. So Nissen said to him, okay, let's make a b'chira test. So he did it for 60 seconds, and then Nissen said, no, you were just a baby for 60 seconds. So Rabbi Denberg related that as an adult, as a married man, as a shliach, he said to himself, he should try to be a beinoni 1 minute a day. So every day for 60 seconds, he goes back to that space he was when his great uncle explained to him that being a beinoni is simply about managing himself, and he does it 1 minute a day. And when I was at a Fabrengen with him a couple of years ago, he said that now he's doing it 2 minutes a day. This is not an unemployed simpleton. This is a very successful shliach in so many ways, and he spends 2 minutes a day being a beinoni, because this is the chinuch that he got as a child. That's midas ha-beinoni, midas kolodom achareha kolodom imshech. Tanya chapter 14. The Rebbe describes a beinoni who takes it one day at a time. He's living moment by moment as a beinoni. He fails, he's not a beinoni. He doesn't fail, he is a beinoni. That's the life of a beinoni on the madrega. That's called midas ha-beinoni, midas kolodom achareha kolodom imshech. That's one idea. But a midas ha-beinoni is not describing a person, it's describing a behavior. You see, you have one of these, you have in Chasidus Salat, you have it in Tanya also. If you have Shema Tev and Shema Pu'ula, you have a descriptive name and a functional name. What's the difference between a melech and a moilech? With a vav. A melech is a king. Moilech is a kinger, one who actively kings. What's the difference between a melech and a moilech? The difference is a melech is a king when he sleeps also. A melech is a king when he has vacation also, because that's his mahus. It's his Shem HaToyah. It's who he is. Eved Hashem. A moilech is somebody who, for this minute, is kinging. The next minute, he could be kidding. So one describes an activity, what one is doing, and the other describes, the correct word is the mahus, the substance of the human being. Wer is der Mensch? Who is the person? So midas ha-beinoni, midas kolodom, chapter 14, is talking not about a person who is in a state of a beinonihud, but a person who's doing beinoni. You see, a person who's doing. He's not a beinoni. He's doing what beinonim do for this minute, for this day, for this week, for this month, for this year, for this lifetime. But it's always 1 day at a time. It's called midas ha-beinoni. And this, of course, is very realistic for us. Alter Rebbe in chapter 14 discusses how the cheshbon of the person, of what's going to keep him being a beinoni, and the cheshbon of the person, what's going to keep him from being not the hepachinyan of beinoni, and so on. Yeah. But then there's something called madregas ha-beinoni, and that's our pedic, the level of beinoni. And when it says over here, that's only madregas ha-beinoni, and that makes it a much, much higher binyan. Because madregas ha-beinoni is not measured in behavior. It's not defining what one is doing, it's defining what one is. Madregas ha-beinoni is not the person who controls himself, but a person who's in control of himself. And there's a big difference between a person who controls himself and a person who's in control. Because the person who's controlling himself 1 second at a time. And when he's sleeping, he has no control. When he's shaking, he has no control. But a person is in control, even when he's sleeping, he's in control, because his mahus is in control. That's called madregas ha-beinoni. It's a much higher level. He has a yetzer hara, and he's only a beinoni. And the place of the winnings is she'ein hara gever al iktana zu aguf. That's it. Just over the guf is the abal habayis. But it's not just something which is defining what he does. It's defining who and what he is. It's defining the mahus of this person is the madrega of a beinoni. That's what Alter Rebbe could say, li'over aveda miyamav, v'layaver li'elam, as I'm going to explain later. Okay? So now here comes the question. You could make a good argument that the word madrege and the word beinani are diametrically opposite. The word tzaddik and the word madrege we understand. Why? A tzaddik killed his Yetzer Hara. So he's in a step of no connection to that. The word rasha and the word madrege, you can also connect now, but then it's not a good madrege, it's a bad thing. He's in the step of doing averos. But if a person is in the step of fighting with himself, so what is he? He's winning the fight this minute. What's going to happen in a minute from now? We don't know. So how could you say he's madrege sabeinani? And yet the Alter Rebbe says there is such a thing as madrege sabeinani. In other words, you could almost say that a beinani is by definition only a shema pa'ula, never a shema tayar. If you wanted, you can argue that a person who's busy fighting with the Yetzer Hara and never giving in can never be called a person who's in a certain level. You can simply say he's a person who's doing certain things. In other words, a beinani is really a rasha who's not sinning. He has a Yetzer Hara. He's susceptible to sin. He's vulnerable to sin. He desires it. He just doesn't do it. His madrege is rasha. But then he's not a rasha b'poyel. He's a rasha b'koyach, but it's nicht gesindigt. Right? You understand? But the Alter says no. There's a madregas habeinani. There's midas habeinani. Midas habeinani is like a rasha who's not sinning. His madrega, his standing, his station is rasha. He has a Yetzer Hara, and he wants to sin. This minute he didn't sin. This day he didn't sin. This week, this month, this year, this life. Madregas habeinani is already, even though it's a person who's struggling with himself, he's still a madregas habeinani. How could such a thing be? How could there be a phenomena of madregas habeinani? And the answer is in the next line. And I want you to see the word inside. Okay, I'm 11 lines into the page. And I'm reading 2 more lines. And I'm reading them to explain to you madregas habeinani. The way I prepared the shiur, and I intend to go back to this next week, but I have to touch on it now. However, muhus v'yatzmus nefesh alekis, the substance and the essence, whatever essence means, of the divine soul, shein esa b'chineseha, which is the 10 faculties of the neshama. In other words, what's above the machshava dibur u'maisa is the chochma, bin, adas, chesed, gvur, teferes, nezech, etit, machas, the seichel and the midas. Says the Rebbe, they alone do not have hamalucha v'hamemshala be'ir ketana or be'ir ketana, the kingship and the dictatorship, the dominion, the dominance over the small city. So why did I read these 2 lines? I read these 2 lines because in these 2 lines you have the word malucha and memshala. These 2 words, malucha and memshala, categorize madregas habeinani as he is distinct from midas habeinani. These 2 words, melucha and memshala, categorize why one person is called a beinani, that's his definition, that's his label, that's his step, and another person is called a beinani, and it only means what he's functionally doing. Tut bepoyel mamish, he's doing what beinanim do, but he's not what a beinani is. In other words, when a rasha doesn't sin, he's midas habeinani, but he's not madregas habeinani. Madregas habeinani is different. Why? Because madregas habeinani is defined by these 2 words, the combination of these 2 words, melucha and memshala. And I want you to know that what I'm sharing with you is based on a note from the Rebbe's Rishimis, which is incredibly short, as is the custom of the Rebbe always, and it's also quite enlightening. And I'm not sure I agree with what says in the footnotes. The way they interpret it, I'm not sure I agree with their interpretation, but what do I know? The people who worked on these svarim can have then I'll know in 100 lifetimes. The Yale worked on this. But I think I may disagree, even though I'm not allowed to disagree. You see, what's the difference in the word melech and the word boish? What's between a king and a dictator? These are Hasidic terminologies, these are Torah terminologies, these are not worldly terminologies. The difference between a king and a dictator is one simple thing. Malchusei beratzon kivolein. A king is accepted by his subjects willfully. And a dictator imposes himself upon the people. A dictator forces on the people. One dictator forces himself on the people using a sword. Another dictator forces himself on the people using power, money. Another person forces himself on the people using coercion, mais, fadreta, maise. But it's always the case that the people are following the dictator not because they like him and they chose him, but because this is what the reality imposes upon them. A king is chosen willfully. And as all of us know, this is the whole chassidus of Rosh Hashanah. And when the Eibishter created the world, he was a dictator. A dictator means he forced his will upon it. And as the Rebbe always says, the Lashon based on the Gemara, the Eibishter betzach by Yidden, Hashem pleads and begs the Jewish people, Tamlichuni Aleichem, I want to be your king, I don't want to be your dictator. But the Eibishter cannot become a king by himself. Because Ein Melech V'lo Yam, kings can't king themselves, people king them. Why? Because a king means the people made him, the people chose. So the Alter Rebbe says, if you want to understand Madregas HaBeinoni, one of the categories of Madregas HaBeinoni, specifically in contrast to Midas HaBeinoni, not in contrast to Rasha and Tzaddik, contrast to what we think a Beinoni is, a person who doesn't sin actually. And Madregas HaBeinoni doesn't mean I don't sin actually. I'm in a Madrega of not sinning. I have a Yetzer Hara, but I'm a Madrega of not sinning. In other words, like I told you before, it's not I'm controlling myself. I'm in control. It's not I didn't do a sin. I'm not doing a sin. I'm not sinning. Requires an understanding of these two terminologies, Melucha and Memshala. Melucha and Memshala means how a Beinoni kings over his body. A Beinoni kinging over his body basically means that he's Madregas Tzaddik. Memshala means a Beinoni is controlling his body. He's controlling his body. And when he's controlling his body, he's fighting with his body. And what makes a Beinoni in the Madrega of Beinoni, rather than a Midah of Beinoni, that he alternates between Melucha and Memshala. Sometimes he's a Melech over his goof. In other words, the state of spiritual intuitus that he's on, he's like a tzaddik. Yetzer Hara doesn't bother him at all. Madregas HaBeinoni. And sometimes he's only Midas HaBeinoni. His inspiration is gone. His Yetzer Hara is awake. Yetzer Hara wants him to sin. He simply doesn't listen. So if you want to understand Madregas HaBeinoni, which is what our Pedic is about, as opposed to Midas HaBeinoni, you have to understand this interface of Melucha and Memshala. I'll put it to you in these words. A tzaddik is always a melech. Midas HaBeinoni and a Rasha is at best a Moshe. A tzaddik is a king over his goof. What's a king over his goof? His goof is a cooperative partner. The goof isn't fighting against his Rasul Dutei mitzvahs. His Nefesh HaBahamis is not even fighting against Rasul Dutei mitzvahs. Why? Hara Shabei Kofaf Latev. Hargeba, he killed his Yetzer Hara. He has no desire to do any Avedis. Why? Because he loves God. That's the definition of tzaddik. He loves God. And therefore automatically hates evil. No, if you love the Eibush, you hate evil, you have no shaychus to Ra. So he's always in a state of being a melech. He's always in a state of kinging over his goof. His goof is always happy to do Ratzneli. A Rasha, or Midas HaBeinoni, which is a Rasha who's not sinning, that's only a Moshe. Every second he's fighting with himself. The Yetzer Hara wants him to sin and he doesn't listen. Madregas HaBeinoni is Moilech Moshe. There are times that he's like a tzaddik. And there are times that he's like a Rasha who's not sinning. And it's this combination of Melucha and Memshala that sets him apart. We're not just talking about a person who's not sinning, we're talking about a person who's in the Madrega of Beinoni. Madregas HaBeinoni. He cannot sin. Even though with the Yetzer Hara, he cannot sin. That's the meaning of the word, because we're talking about a Beinoni, that because of the combination of Melech and Moshel, he's not just not sinning, actually he's above the whole phenomenon of sin. Now with the sheet of next week, we're going to be explaining at length Melech. The Nekuda is that there are times that when a Beinoni davens, his Yetzer Hara goes to sleep. When a Beinoni davens, his Yetzer Hara goes to sleep. When a Beinoni gets involved in Avodas HaTefillah, and he does his bonus, and he arouses in himself Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, a love for God and a fear of God, to serve Hashem with passion during the duration of his davening. As he davens, the Yetzer Hara goes to him. At that moment, he's like a tzaddik. When he finishes davening, and he stops focusing on the Eibishter, because he has a Yetzer Hara, that Ava Vayira goes away. If he had no Yetzer Hara, so when he finishes davening, there's no reason for the Avas Hashem and the Yiras Hashem not to stay. He has no enemy. But since he does have a Yetzer Hara, he's only Madregas HaBeinoni, he's not Madregas Tzaddik. So when he finishes davening, the Ra is Chayzev and Eir, And he no longer has those feelings that make him a king over himself. In other words, he no longer has those feelings that make him in such a state that he has no shaykhs to Neveda. Now he has shaykhs to Neveda. He's just not sinning. So all day long, he's like Midas HaBeinani. During davening, he's like Madregas Tzadik. You put those two together, that's Madregas Beinani. The interface between Melech and Moshe tells you what Madregas HaBeinani is as opposed to Midas HaBeinani. The fact that he has times in his life that his Avodas Hashem is so successful, that he's like a tzaddik, the Yitzhak is not bothering him. And then when that time passes, and that inspiration is gone, he sustains his Beinani status by not listening to Yitzhak, Madrega of Memshala, he controls himself. That combination is the Madregas HaBeinani. And you could say legitimately about Madregas HaBeinani that Layavar, he hasn't sinned and he will never sin. I told this to you a number of times that just on the other day, Mrs. Katzman told us a story about her husband, her late husband, Zeli Katzman, Olav Shalom. So her son gave out a little pamphlet about her husband for one of the yortzeits, and I came across it, I don't know where, and I read it. And in that pamphlet it's written that the Rebbe said to the Mashpiyim in 770, our Rebbe, in America, about him, about Zeli Katzman, wie steht jetzt is nicht shaykh to an aveda. The Rebbe said to the Mashpiyim, the way he's standing right now, he has no connection to an aveda. He was a bocher. In other words, the Lamhaza hadn't hit. The Rebbe wasn't saying he was a tzaddik, because if he's a tzaddik, he'll never have a shaykh to an aveda. But the way he's standing right now, not he doesn't sin, he's not shaykh to an aveda. Not shaykh to an aveda is not midas habeinani, but it's not tzaddik either. Madregas habeinani is not shaykh to an aveda. Why? Because there's so much fire, there's so much Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem in his life, and there's also the dictatorial skill that when the fire subsides, there's the self-control, there's the discipline, there's the Nehelian. That combination translates into Madregas HaBeinani. And that's what it means when the Rebbe Rashab said about the Bishol Neach, Zeitenweise said the Beinani, occasionally the Beinani. His Neach was such a big chassid. The Rebbe Rashab, when he said Zeitenweise the Beinani, he meant Madregas HaBeinani. Midas HaBeinani, I think more than one of the Chassidim who learned in Lubavitch from Midas HaBeinani. Madregas HaBeinani is deeper than Midas HaBeinani. Because Midas HaBeinani is a behavioral control. Madregas HaBeinani is a spirit, it's a level, it's a definition. It's a Shema Toya. It's not describing an action, it's describing a person. This is a very, very high Madrege. And therefore the Alter Rebbe says, you understand? Has never sinned.
But it doesn't mean never sinned from when he was born.
Oh, wait. Now, so the Rebbe has footnotes on this. Yeah? And it's a very, very familiar question. And I'll present you the issue with the following question. Which is more difficult to understand? The Le'ovar, the Le'yaver? That he has never sinned or that he will never sin? So most people would say the Le'yaver, he will never sin. How could you know what's going to happen tomorrow? How could you know what's going to happen tomorrow? You can make a prediction. He has a Yetzer Hara. You're admitting he has a Yetzer Hara. None of us are then. He's standing in a state of Madregas HaBeinani Lucha Memshala. How do you know what's going to happen the rest of his life? But as it turns out, the more difficult thing to understand is the Le'over, not the Le'yaver. The Le'yaver, the Rebbe explains by Pashtus, and this is from Bechsidim, from Amol, I think from the Rebbeim also, but the Rebbe talks about it as well. Le'yaver means via steht jetzt, like the Rebbe said about the Rebbe Katzman. Via steht jetzt, as he's standing right now, he has no shaychus to Neveda. If he's a tzaddik, it's not via steht jetzt. In other words, he's in a state of Beinani. If he continues the station where he is right now, he will never be able to sin, not because he has no Yetzer Hara, because Madregas HaBeinani, the combination of Melucha and Memshala, doesn't allow for it. So Le'yaver is easier to understand, actually. How can you predict about a person who never sin? And the answer, not predicting about a person who never sin, you're predicting about a person that if he's always in the Maimah the Matzav, he's now, he'll never do an Aveda. Because he's not just a Beinani B'Shem HaPu'ula, he's not just a Beinani in his actions, which is called Midas HaBeinani. Midas HaBeinani, he's Madregas HaBeinani. The Rebbe's Kasha is the Le'yaver. What's bothering the Rebbe is, could you say that once a person does one Aved in his life, he can never again achieve Beinani, he can never achieve Madregas HaBeinani? Now you could make an argument, you can make a very good argument, and the Torah is, yeah, why? Because once a person did an Aved, he can be higher than a Beinani, he can become a Balchula, or but a Beinani nisht. He can become a Balchula is higher than Beinani. But a Beinani to be, again, he cannot be. And I think there are sichas from the Rebbe which entertain this line of reasoning, okay? But the Rebbe says that that's not the pshat. Le'avar Aveda B'yamav doesn't necessarily mean he never did an Aveda. Le'avar Aveda B'yamav means he never did an Aveda for which he didn't do tshuva. For which he didn't do tshuva. Once a person does tshuva, so then you could again say about him, Le'avar Aveda B'yamav. But the Rebbe says, but if you look at the words, it doesn't just say, I'm reading inside, yeah, it's 9 lines into the Pedic. But then it says, Mail, if you want to say because he did tshuva, fine. But it doesn't just say that, it says he was never titled Rasha even for 1 hour, 1 moment of life. How could you say, if a person did one Aveda, at that moment he was a Rasha, that becomes irreversible. It's a fact. So the Rebbe adds a higher level. And the higher level is that there's something called Tshuva Miyavar Rabba, the higher Madrega of Tshuva. And Tshuva Miyavar Rabba erases the Aveda L'Mafrei, he never sinned. And the Rebbe says that's the pshat. He brings the Lashon Rambam that a person has free will. That's the pshat. Lo Yavar Aveda B'Yom. Lo Yavar, he will never do an Aveda means Adviyah state yet in its current condition. Lo Yavar means, first of all, it means he did tshuva, and second of all, he did tshuva in such a madrega that the Aveda that he did yesterday is not his. It's gone. And therefore, madrega sabeinani, because the way the Rebbe words it is, because any person has the free will to do tshuva if he chooses to, including tshuva law, including tshuva miyavar rabba. So it's possible a person who did an Aveda to be in a Maimed Matzah that you could say, may the law of Yodeya Ta'alumes, that the Eibush should witness that the way he's standing right now, he never did it. He did it. He didn't do it. The Aveda that happened to somebody else. That's what the Rebbe explains, Le'over V'Le'yav. So understand what we're talking about. We're talking about Madrega Sabeinani. And again, the key to understanding Madrega Sabeinani, and we're going to talk about it again next week with more Ariches, is Melucho Memshala. He's a king and a dictator. Sometimes he's a melech, and sometimes he's a moshel. That combination makes that he's not only functionally a Beinani, but he's in the Mehus Madregas HaBeinani. He's substantively in the level of Madregas HaBeinani, the level, the step of Beinani. And that's why we say Le'yavid, the way he stands now, will never do an Aveda. And we even say Le'yavid because he did tshuva, and he's in the position to do tshuva Me'yavar Rabba, and it's as if he never did the Aveda in the first place. Okay? So one more thing, and that is, one of the issues that the Tanya did is what it streamlined the Gemaras, right? In the Gemara you have Tzadik V'Tevle, Tzadik V'Rale, Rosh V'Tevle, Rosh V'Rale. Then you have Tzadik Gomer, Tzadik She'ini Gomer, Rosh Gomer, Rosh She'ini Gomer. And I told you so many times over the last few Prakim that Tzadik, it's Abi Nigle, Tzadik V'Tevle, and Tzadik V'Rale, Rosh V'Tevle, and Rosh V'Rale is talking about his Gash mystical life, how he's doing material. Tzadik Gomer, Tzadik She'ini Gomer, Rosh Gomer is talking about his Ruch musical life, how he's doing spiritual. But the Alter Rebbe says they're the same. Tzadik V'Tevle, Tzadik Gomer. If a Tzadik has it good, B'Gashmi, it's like, it's a perfect Tzadik. Tzadik V'Rale, Tzadik was the bad B'Gashmi, it's like Tzadik She'ini Gomer. Same as true Rosh. In other words, we join together the term that normally, that technically, that classically, that traditionally connotes the Gash musical life of the Tzaddik and the Rasha, with the definition that defines the spiritual condition of the Tzaddik and the Rasha, right? The Tzaddik Gomer, the Tzaddik Gomer, Tzaddik V'Tevle, there's no Ra left in him. A Rasha Gomer is Rasha V'Rale, there's no Toiv left in him, the B'chinas Gilut, the B'chinas Makif, like we learned last Sunday. And the opposite is true of Tzaddik V'Rale, so he's a Tzaddik She'ini Gomer, there's Ra inside of him. Rasha V'Tevle, the Shoyim Leim Chariyat, he's not a Rasha V'Rale, he still has good in his consciousness. All of this was discussed in the previous Rabbim. But by Beinani we don't use those terms. You don't use the term Beinani Gomer, Beinani She'ini Gomer. You don't use the term Beinani V'Tevle and Beinani V'Rale. We sort of accept that he's in the middle on both fronts. You see, in Gashmias for sure there's a Beinani V'Tevle and a Beinani V'Rale. Some Beinanim have good lives, some Beinanim have hard lives. So Begashmias, the definitions Beinani V'Tevle and Beinani V'Rale you can understand. But Beruchnius, you cannot say about Beinani V'Tevle and Beinani V'Rale in the extreme sense. Because a Beinani for sure has Ra, and a Beinani for sure has Toif. So I guess every Beinani is Beinani V'Rale, or however you want to word it. And I suppose you can't say Beinani Gomur and Beinani She'eni Gomur, because the very definition of Beinani is that he's not Gomur. He's not Gomur in this direction, not Gomur in this direction. But I'm still curious about how we would understand these terms, certainly the terms Tevle and Nale, as they relate to Beinani. I don't have clarity on the issue, but since in Perek Yud I started the Perek talking about Tzaddik, and I made a very big deal out of the Tevle and the Nale and the Gomur and the She'eni Gomur. And in Perek Yud Aleph, I did the same thing for Rasha. I didn't want to finish this class by at least pointing out that these are things which we're not clear about. Could you say Beinani Gomer, Beinani She'eni Gomer, Beinani V'tei, Beinani V'ralei? I don't know, and that's all I'm finishing. I just wanted to leave you with this. Okay, so what did we learn today? We learned the first 10 lines. It's a lot, 10 lines. We defined the Beinani. A Beinani is somebody who's only winning his Yetzer Hara on the level of Ekhanaz or Aguf. And he never lets the Yetzer Hara win. And because he's in Madrega Sabbaini, and the Taich Madrega Sabbaini is that he's the combination of Melucha and Memshala, he's called Le'yam of Le'yam. Okay? Okay, let's break, and we'll do Hayem Yem. And I should say every day, Yesem Imasha Apara, Yesem Egal, Egal, Yesem Apara.